We're going to get started. Thank you everyone so much for coming. This is a great turnout. I'll introduce myself. My name is Cooper Richardson. I'm a 1L, a member of the Immigration Law Students Association, which is co-sponsoring this event with the Law Library and the College of Law. And we are here today with Todd Miller, who is an author and an independent journalist. And Todd Miller writes a weekly post for the Border Chronicle. He has researched and written about border issues for more than 15 years, the last 8 as an independent journalist and writer. He resides here in Tucson, Arizona, but has also spent many years living and working in Oaxaca, Mexico. His work has appeared in the New York Times, Tom Dispatch, The Nation, San Francisco Chronicle, In These Times, Guernica, and Al Jazeera English, among other places. Miller has authored 4 books: Build Bridges, Not Walls, which is the book we'll be talking about today, Empire of Borders, Storming the Wall, and Border Patrol Nation. He's also a contributing editor on border and immigration issues for the NACLA Report on the Americas and its column Border Wars. Thank you so much for coming. So we are gonna do kind of a discussion format. We'll have Todd talk for a while and then do a Q&A. If you do have questions in the meantime, feel free to raise your hand and we'll answer them as we can. And if you're on Zoom, just go ahead and type your questions in the chat. We'll be keeping an eye on that as well. And if you're here in person following the event, we'll have pizza in the kitchen right over there. So thank you so much, and let's get started.
Thank you. Thank you for saying. Thanks so much. It's great to be here. Yeah, great to be here in Tucson. I often go around in different places and do talks like this. And occasionally I'm right here where I live and where I'm sure many people know what I'm talking about as opposed to other places. Anyhow, so I'm going to talk about this book today, Build Bridges, Not Walls. I think I'm going to try to go for about 30 minutes or so and then have like discussion after. That sounds good. I want to say right off the bat that Build Bridges, Not Walls is my 4th book, but it differs from my other 3 books. My other 3 books are in that they're all here: Border Patrol Nation, Storming the Wall, and actually there's one that's not called Empire of Borders. Those other books are more straightforward investigative journalism. Like in Border Patrol Nation, which was published in 2014, I was really looking at the post 9/11 massive expansion of the US border apparatus. And so I followed that route in that book. And then the Storming the Wall was almost a sequel of Border Patrol Nation, but looking at it from the angle of climate change and climate displacement. And then Empire of Borders, the book that's not here, that somebody has checked out. Empire of Borders is a book that I followed the money, really, like the traditional journalistic maxim of following the money. So I followed US border programs abroad, like to the Mexico-Guatemala border, to the Guatemalan-Honduran border, to the Dominican-Haitian border, to the Jordanian-Syrian border, to the Kenyan-Tanzania border, to the Philippines. So pretty much, you can see it's a pretty international book, but really trying to figure out what U.S. programs are abroad and how they're assisting other countries building up their borders. And so Build Bridges, Not Walls is more of a reflection of those years of reporting, a reflection, a meditation, I would say, looking across those 3 books and before, like doing the reporting before those 3 books even. And I want to say it like that because there's an argument in it, of course, but A Journey to a World Without Borders is the subtitle, right? But it's also, in my mind, it's a book that I'm just trying to raise questions based on all these years of reporting, right? Some questions that maybe the questions I feel at least need to be raised, and to look at the border, to look at what's going on in the border and how to proceed from here. And so, so on one hand, it was a meditation, and on the other hand, it came from a very specific encounter I had in the desert. And I'm going to tell a little bit about that story of how the book was born. I was out, and feel free, as Cooper said, to you could interject questions at any time. That's totally fine. I was out in the desert a few years ago, and I was in the Babakivari mountain range. For, I imagine many, if not all, are familiar with the Babakivari mountain range. It's a mountain range that's on the edge of the Tohono O'odham Nation. And I was with a Tohono O'odham elder, and we climbed up to the peak of the Babakivari peak. And as we were doing that, I remember walking up the path. The trail was switching back, right, as it does when you go up these hills or these mountains. And I remember looking back and seeing like that beautiful Sonoran desert landscape, right, with the ocotillos and the saguaros. And then looking, even further into like the gigantic sky, and then looking even further and seeing like, mountain ranges that were far away, like maybe 30 miles, maybe 50 miles, maybe 70 miles, maybe I don't even know how far you can see when you're at the top of a mountain. But I was certain, and I was about 20 miles north of the US-Mexico border. And I was sure I was looking into Mexico, but I had no idea that what was Mexico and what was not Mexico. So in other words, in that moment, like the border really didn't exist. It was a fleeting moment. It was a moment that would end, as I will explain here in a second. But there was this like, you just look and yeah, it's a liberating feeling, or I had a liberating feeling in that moment. And then about an hour and a half later, maybe it was 2 hours, whatever it took for us to come down, and then for me to get in the car and to drive down the mountain and go down the dirt road from the Babakivaris to Tapawa, which is basically going up through cells and getting back to Tucson. I came down the mountain range. I was coming down that dirt road, rumbling along, and all of a sudden a man appeared at the side of the road, and the man was waving his arms and looked like he was in distress. So I stopped the car, and he came over to where I was, and I rolled down my window, and I had some extra water, and I gave him a water bottle because he said I asked him if there's anything he needed and if he wanted some water, and he said yes. And then I asked him, "Is there anything else that I could do for you?" And he said, "Can you give me a ride to the next town?" And so this is when this book, Build Bridges Not Walls, was born, because I hesitated in that moment. I hesitated. I just thought about like all this reporting that I'd done on the border. I knew what was all around us. I knew that moment in that moment of seeing, in Mexico in the mountain ranges, that was really kind of an illusion on it to a degree, because I knew there was roving patrols, probably Green Stripe Border Patrol vehicles somewhere around. I knew that there were implanted motion sensors that were, all around. Nobody knows where they are, but they're around. I knew that there were surveillance towers with cameras that could see probably 7 or 8 miles away. I knew that there might be even a drone flying overhead 30,000 feet that could detect us there. In fact, I should mention, I just came back from last week. I was in San Antonio for what is called the Border Security Expo. And that's an annual event, which basically it's all about the new technology going on the border, what's being imagined. And in this event, there was about 200 companies, private companies, that came and displayed their different technologies that they're thinking about or trying to sell to CBP or DHS or ICE or border sheriffs to be deployed on the border. And and this is the 5th time I've been to the Border Security Expo. So I've been to it many, many times, but there's a lot of the sort of technology now. Now there's a lot of UGRs, what they call like unmanned ground systems, UGSs, unmanned ground systems, like robots. I don't know if people have seen the robotic dogs that there was an article about that not too long ago. They were actually there. So the company named Ghost Robotics that was manufacturing the robotic dogs was there and displaying the dogs. And among other things, there's all kinds of drones, from the aerial drones to the ground drones to biometrics to the whole gamut, of what you see on the border. So I was just there. I have that fresh in my mind. That's why I'm sharing it with you right now. I just got back like 2 days ago. But knowing all that and in that moment and knowing, what's in the desert, and then furthermore, knowing that if I were to give, I found out later that his name's Juan Carlos. If I was to give Juan Carlos a ride, that I could get pulled over by Border Patrol and arrested and perhaps face a felony charge and prison time. And so that hesitation went on. And of course I couldn't hesitate for too long because we're just there in the road. And then I felt ire, anger that I even had to hesitate, right? Because here I was, and then of course I like knowing why people are walking through the desert, knowing that people are walking through the desert all the time, knowing that people walk through the desert and they don't have enough water, they don't have enough food, that it's been purposely designed this way through the prevention through deterrence strategy. That's been the strategy on the border, on the US-Mexico border, pretty much since 1994. That strategy purposely forces people into remote areas, right? And when they cross like this area of the desert, and knowing that, I think the count is from the US Border Patrol, 8,000 remains of people have been found since the 1990s in the US-Mexico borderlands of people crossing the border. And the humanitarian aid organization No More Deaths say that they think it's 3 to 10 times more. So there's probably a lot of remains that have not been recovered. So knowing all this, knowing like, yeah, because Juan Carlos, he chugged down the water really fast, actually. And knowing, it seems obvious that you should give the guy a ride, right? But at the same time, the contemplation and provoked the ire, and it was within the ire and that sort of like meditation of reporting that this book was born. And one more thing about how this book was born was there was those 2 components of it and that incident. And then I took those questions that the incident provoked, questions that I had rumbling around anyhow, right? Like what is this thing, this border, apparatus that we have? And so I took that question to many people, and you'll see that in the book. I interview a lot of different people in this, not only experts and the experts on the matter who I do interview, but also like I would call visionaries and poets and artists and border patrol agents. In fact, I'm going to talk a little bit about a border patrol agent who I interviewed, who actually I think when he left the border patrol, he ended up going to the University of Arizona Law School. So maybe some of you know him. And I also interviewed kids, and that's it was the kids, and I want to share a quote from my own kid from the book that really I think captures what the spirit of the book is. And that spirit actually, when it was funny, when I was writing it, I had to write it and then rewrite it, and I rewrote it during 2020 during the pandemic year, but they sent, when I was doing the rewrite of it, and I did the rewrite because I decided to do the rewrite myself. But the rewrite, the publisher sent this cover, and the cover, as you, I don't know if you can all see it, but it's of the chain link fence, and it's one of the parts is turning into what appears to be a bird, you know, and the idea of they sent me that, and I'm like, wow, that's wow, you know, that kind of framed how they almost framed what I was trying to do with the book. But the quote I want to share with you also, it's very similar. I was when I was writing the book, went to San Diego to Imperial Beach. Imperial Beach is where the border wall goes out into the ocean, about maybe 30 yards. And I was there with my then 4-year-old, now 6-year-old son, and we were walking towards the border wall because people in Tijuana on the other side were waving back and forth. So we were just walking up to talk to them. And when we were doing that, there was a border patrol agent who was perched up above us on kind of a hill, who William, my 4-year-old at the time, he started running for the wall, and then he was ahead of me, but then the border patrol agent hit his what's it called, the horn. Yeah, the horn. And for those that have heard the horn from the border patrol, it has this kind of metallic sound. It's like ah. And then the border patrol agent had an intercom, so he went, "Do not go any further," to my 4-year-old, right? And so my 4-year-old he stopped and he looked up, and then he then being a 4-year-old, right, kept going, and then again, "Do not go any further." And so the second time, when the border patrol agent did that, he just stopped and sat in the sand. And then we sat in the sand for a bit, and he had these questions about the wall because we were right kind of close to it. But I don't know why the agent wouldn't allow us to go all the way up to the wall, but we were about maybe 20 or 30 feet away, and we started talking about it. And then finally he said, to make a long story short, and he just learned the word excavator. He said, "Why can't we take an excavator and crush the wall, and then crush the wall and then build bikes from?" So that I think captures in a lot of ways what I was trying to do with this book. So next I want to bring up the story from the the U of A law student, former border patrol agent, Brendan Lenahan. Does anybody know him? Anyhow, he came here for, I think he graduated from law school here. But anyhow, he told me a story which I want to share because it also illustrates, I think, some of the, you know, it definitely raises these questions about the border. But this comes from the view of a border patrol agent, right, in the field, I guess you could say. And so his story goes, I interviewed him extensively about this. He was patrolling near Arivaca, right? So it's just a little bit, an hour and a half south of here, about 10 miles north of the US-Mexico border. And he's driving, and he gets a call from dispatch, and dispatch tells him that some people had walked over ground sensors that were up on top of this mountain. So he drives up, and it's a steep drive up this mountain to the top, where there was an empty mine shaft. And when he got up to the top, he said he saw lots of footprints. So he got out of the vehicle, and he was going to follow the footprints. That's what he's planning to do, when all of a sudden a man came out of the ravine in front of him, and kind of waving his arms in distress as well, like Juan Carlos was when I was in the experience that I already shared. So it was a similar situation. And Brendan said that instead of what normally he might do would be to arrest the man or ask the man for his papers, instead he decided to follow the man into the ravine. He did put on his assault rifle. So he put this assault rifle on, and then went down and followed this man to the ravine. At the bottom of the ravine, turns out that man's brother was in distress, and that man's cousin was holding the man's brother by actually rocking the man's brother back and forth. And what Brendan described was a situation where he knew that the younger brother was in trouble, and that and he described a situation where there was bile coming out of his mouth, and his eyes were like going up, so all he could see was the whites of his eyes. And so he ends up calling, he calls dispatch and asks for them to bring a helicopter, which they say they can't get, they can, but they can't get down into the ravine. So they had to bring up the younger brother to the top. And in order to do that, they had to form kind of a stretcher, like a human stretcher. So what Brendan did was he clasped hands with the older brother, and the cousin held the younger brother's head, and they brought him up that way. So they clasped, actually they didn't clasp hands at first, they clasped at the elbows, but it was one of those days, September, Arizona, right? Really kind of hot, started sweating, and then their hands started to slip. And the next thing you knew that they were holding hands. And so how Brendan describes that moment was probably one of the most, well, I'll just explain it, you can judge for yourself. But so he's holding his hands, and he says, this is one of the most strangely intimate moments that I've had. Here I am, and the way he said in the interview, here I am holding the hands of somebody I'd usually be arresting. And then they continue to hold hands. And then as he describes the story, he forgets who he is. He looks down at the younger brother, and he thinks the younger brother is actually his younger brother. And this goes on for a long moment, I think. So they're walking. He thinks that the younger brother is his younger brother. And then all of a sudden his radio cracks. And when his radio cracks, of course, he goes back to being a Border Patrol agent, right? Who he is a Border Patrol agent. So long story short, they get up to the top. And as they're going up, the younger brother is vomiting and then loses consciousness, and the younger brother passes away. There's more to the story. It's in the book, but Brendan ends up going to a bar with other Border Patrol agents later that night to try to commit, and the other agents knew that he was, that they tried to give him support and said, don't worry. The way he described it in an interview, one said, it's all part of the quote unquote border game, right? This idea that people dying, crossing the desert, the way that the whole strategy is designed is part of it. Most Border Patrol agents have come across dead people, have encountered dead people in the desert. And so he was still feeling that didn't comfort him. So he ends up going home, and he the next day his supervisor calls him, and the supervisor says, don't worry, they were drug mules. And so people bringing drugs across the border, allegedly. And so Brendan, he didn't say that he said this to his supervisor, but when he was telling me in the interview, he looked at me and said, what did I care? What did I care in that moment? And I wanted to read a direct quote from him. It says, to me, it doesn't make a difference. They just seem like regular guys. And who knows what kind of job I would have had if I grew up with them in their situation in life. It could have been me. And then he says, someone died trying to sneak drugs into the country. And I went out there and had this strange and traumatic experience trying to both stop them and help them, which is interesting. And now my neighbor, this is the next part of it. After the call of the supervisor, turns out his neighbor below was smoking weed. And this is before it was legal in Arizona, by the way. And it wafted into his apartment. And so he says, and now my neighbor is smoking the very same thing I'm trying to stop. he says there is an element of absurdity to it all, right? There's an element of absurdity, really, what he's saying to the border, right? And we could go in, and I go into in the book, like looking at the different things that the border claims that it does, and you know, and question, you know, looks at all the different things, you know, the different justifications for it. And you can find the element of absurdity, as Brendan just said, you know, in throughout most of the claims. But I wanted to stress one part of it. Okay, which is the realization that the border, you know, his the way that he explained it, and in such a way, like what a, you know, where we're born, you know, the whole idea of the border itself being an impediment to justice, an impediment itself, the very nature of the border as an impediment to justice. And that's one of the big insights. I mean, you could draw a lot of insights from that story, but that's a big one for me. And so, and anyone has any questions or comments, please feel free to jump in. But I'm going to go to the last part of what I wanted to say, and I want to go back to my kid saying build bikes, not walls, sort of. But I wanted to like look at it and then apply it to the budget, right? The border budgets. What if, okay, so probably not going to go take the chainsaws down to the border wall and slice it down and build bikes from them right now. Maybe it's a goal for a 20-year goal or something. But you could apply it to that, you know, yearly annual process of budget making. Like I think they're going in Washington, they're about to go into appropriations process, and to look at, you know, yet again, financing customs and border protection, CBP, ICE, you know, the whole thing, DHS. And what if you applied that to the budget, the idea of build bikes, not walls, right? So I'd like to frame that a little bit, and like looking at the border budgets over the years, right? Okay, I'll ask you, well, no, it might be hard to guess, but in 1994, the budget for border and immigration enforcement through the Immigration and Naturalization Service was $1.5 billion. Okay, so INS, of course, was before pre-DHS. DHS implemented in 2003. So that budget has grown steadily over the last more than 25 years. Each year, more and more and more and more and more. So does anybody know what the budget is? If you just look at now CBP and ICE, you put those two agencies together this year, 2022, does anybody know what the budget is? 1.5 billion in 1994.
Billion?
Close with 20 billion, even higher, 25 billion. 25 billion, so if you can look at it in a number of different ways. If you look at the last 25 years, you're seeing the most historic or dramatic buildup of the US border and immigration enforcement apparatus ever. Like never has it grown so much. For example, in 1994, and I like the year 1994 because that's the year when a number of different operations like Operation Gatekeeper and Operation Safeguard and Operation Hold the Line and the prevention to deterrent strategy was implemented. So that's why I'm using that particular year. But 1994, there was 4,000 Border Patrol agents. And Border Patrol was formed in 1924. So they've been around for 70 years. Before that, there was no Border Patrol. There was other things, but not Border Patrol. And then now, in fact, by the year 2012, Border Patrol went up to 21,000. So it was 5 times more from 1994 to 2012. And so you can look at all the different, you know, you can look at it from a number of different angles, from wall building, right? If you look at the 1994 operations, walls built out of landing mats from the Vietnam and Persian Gulf Wars were built in border cities like Nogales. And then in 2006, there was another big wall project called based off the Secure Fence Act, which built nearly 700 miles of walls and barriers, which we were just discussing. And you look at the technology that's been placed on the borders over those years, billions of dollars, and the stuff that I was just talking about, as well as detention centers and the whole kind of deportation apparatus that goes along with it. And so there's been just this massive expansion of it. And so why can't you apply, this is the question that I'm raising. I'm not saying it's hard to do, but why can't we apply that to the budget? Why can't we look at the budget and say, isn't there something else we could spend this money on? Isn't it possible? Now you could take the $25 billion and go, wow, there's a lot, or you could just not increase it every year, right? Like every year, year after year, it goes up and up and up and up. Like what if you shaved off $1 billion and did something else with it for 2023? As an example, if you wanted more doable practical steps, right? But looking at it, like if you're thinking of human security or you're thinking of human well-being, if you're thinking of like kids not drinking leaded water in Flint, Michigan, right? Or clean water or affordable housing, just looking at different possibilities where that money, student loans, right? What if all that money was put on student, help like alleviate student loans? Or this past year, right before the Glasgow Climate Summit, COP in October, I think it was, I helped write a report that looked at a climate change and the top historic emitters and the number, how much money that the top emitters in the world. Of course, the United States is #1 historic emitter. And then I can send the link to the actual report. But if you look at the amount of money going to border and immigration enforcement compared to climate action, like helping, giving money to countries that are suffering from sea level rise, for example, is one. That sort of, like in the United States, we looked at from the years from 2013 to 2018, 13-to-1 ratio going to border and immigration enforcement to helping with climate action. In other words, what I'm pointing out is possibly when you're thinking of security, you're thinking of even stopping displacement, you're thinking about human well-being, there are at least other things that we can think about. And I'm not saying I have the answers. Again, I just want to stress that. I just want to raise the questions. And I think like those questions are there, like is there something better we can do for the benefit of humanity? My answer, I think, is yes, but I'll leave it to you what you think. And then the last thing I wanted to mention, and this is probably one of the biggest things or things that I concluded from this book, was I want to return to Juan Carlos when that moment. And in that moment, and I really can't say what I did. You can guess what I did. You're probably right, but I can't say it. But I realized, like, it was such a quick time with Juan Carlos that like he knows, right? He's the one that knows what the answers are. Like why would somebody like him or the hundreds of people that are crossing on a daily basis be doing this? Why? The reasons, like, why can't we dialogue with him? Like, he's from Guatemala? Why can't we know where he's from in Guatemala and what's going on there and what is the reason why that he left in the begin with? And what usually multiple factors, right? And I know like where he was from, or where he told me he was from, that among 1,000 other things, climate change has been a huge factor in droughts, and rain's not coming when after planting, and the harvest don't come and they wilt. That he didn't, we didn't get to talk about that specifically, but he could have if we would have talked. Like and that's one of the things that I mean, I really, by writing this book, I really took away from myself. And I guess this is one of the things that I really wanted. I wanted that people reading this book to take away from it. That I believe, and based on these years of doing this work and this incident and many other incidents, I'm just bringing up this particular one, is that like this kind of cross-border solidarity where people are listening to each other, and I think it's in those conversations and those dialogues where many answers, many solutions could be found. And I'll leave it at that. And for questions.
Yeah, thank you so much. Definitely want to leave some time for questions. Does anybody have anything right after that?
I have a lot of questions, but something that I really appreciated about this book is that it felt a lot more hopeful than your other books, and hope can feel really elusive in this field in our current reality. So I was wondering if that was your intent, and if you ever faltered writing it, or what that process was like of trying to be hopeful about things.
I think I just was. I think I almost, I don't know, like I was searching for maybe, I don't know. I wasn't trying to be hopeful, but that's how it was. Like writing the other books, like you mentioned, more straightforward investigative journalism going into these things. And I mean, it just almost as part of my own way of my own trajectory, I guess, this, yeah, I think I just openly embraced that part of it, and that I wanted to, and I felt the need to do it. But I wasn't like, it's almost in retrospect that I'm saying it, like when I was writing it, it didn't say, I wasn't saying, I have to be hopeful.
Yeah.
And it was more like, that's how it came out. And now I'm really glad that's how it came out. And that's probably a bad explanation.
No, that's helpful. Listening to Silvio Rodriguez helps too.
Yeah, I love
that
listening to
quote.
Silvio Rodriguez.
He's my favorite.
Did I mention him in the?
Yeah, you had a quote, prefiero soñar con cosas imposibles.
Yes.
De lo posible ya se sabe demasiado.
Yeah.
I threw the book when I read that.
Yeah, I love that
I
quote.
got very excited.
Questions? I appreciated you talking about the student groups you brought down and the dialogue that happened around that. That is so much of what we see with study abroad student groups. And I'm wondering, for law students who might want to make alliances, the kind of alliances we were just talking about, and not just go and have some border tourism, what are some concrete pieces of advice that you would give based on the conversations?
Yeah. I mean, I really like, I know that like talking about the student group was yeah, I know what you're saying. I also think that those meetings, with groups, including, I would say, law students, and like going to like in the book, went to a shelter, but having that dialogue with people, and like having people, like, you never know how the dialogue's going to go, but it should be on even ground, right? And in that case, of course, people ask, why are you here? Like, what good is this going to do us that you're here? And those questions, I think, are super, like, for us, if we were sitting in a shelter right now and that's what people asked us, I think those are the questions that cut right to the core. And I think those sorts of experiences are awesome. But the problem is that they're, again, fleeting, right? You leave and then that's that. And I think, like, going back to the end part, like, what I think that one of the big things is, like, keeping that cross-border solidarity alive, like not just have that one experience and come back, but like cultivating it, bringing it. You know, it might not be with that person in the shelter, it might be with another group, an organization, or it could be a number of different things. But I think like that the more like cross-border stuff, engagement that people have, and in more long-term ways, I think could be one way that because I like for having experienced that myself too, really, you know, I don't see how you ever come back after that.
We have a question in the chat. How does living in Tucson impact your experiences and investigations compared to authors that do not have lived border experiences?
Oh, I mean, very much so. Like, yeah, I mean, being right, and I travel to the border and cross the border constantly. So yeah, it's constantly informed by living where I live geographically, for sure. And actually my work itself has expanded to many borders around the world where I don't live. So it's always good, you know, like people will come into Tucson and want to report on the border, and sometimes I'll meet with them, right? But then people pay me the favor too if I go to like all the borders I mentioned in Empire of Borders, like the Tanzania Kenyan border. You know, I don't know anything about that border. I didn't know anything about that border, but I had all these people I could meet with and show me, you know, and it was so like being able to like go in there and really like not just take those first superficial analysis you get, but go deep and be able to talk to people. I think that's really valuable too.
So like it might be a big question, but as you mentioned, you work with other borders. So when we compare like Western countries like United States and we say Europe, how do you compare the system of border like, treatments to people or something else?
From what I've seen, all the borders are very different in ways, but they're all very much the same in ways. Like you can look at the European Union, the kind of what some people call Fortress Europe, right? That's around the Schengen area, of course, is where people can travel from country to country, but out on the fringes of that, then that becomes like on that, you see like a more fortification. And then you see like you could say, oh, the prevention through deterrence strategy that you see on the US-Mexico border, you see it right in this desert here. And then in Europe, of course, very similar is the Mediterranean Sea. And then that's sort of that's those sorts of like I remember going to the Dominican Haitian border, and I went there because the US Border Patrol had gone and trained a new border patrol for the Dominican Republic, and that the United States had also transferred equipment there. So I went to check it out. And they had only been around for a couple of years, 3 years when I went there. But I remember looking at it, and they had put up protest barriers, kind of like the wall. And they were sitting on their X's, and by they, I mean the Dominican border guard. Sitting on their X's is what the US Border Patrol does. If you go down in Nogales, you'll see every quarter mile, you'll see a Border Patrol agent stationed watching the wall. Dominican border guard was doing the same thing. Every couple hundred yards, I think there was one. They were posted standing. But I remember looking at it and going, wow, that's like a miniature version of the US-Mexico border in Nogales, but this is how it's translating here. And then the whole purpose of it is you blockade that area so people go around. So yeah, I remember going, and one more little anecdote, I went to the Kenya-Tanzania border, and we went, and this was right after I went to Israel and Palestine. And so I was there, and then I went, which you see the big concrete walls and the surveillance systems. I went straight from Tel Aviv to Nairobi, and then went down to that southern border in Tanzania. And they took me down to that border, and it was just a crumbling monument. That's all it was. There's nothing there. and you looked in the distance and I could see like an elephant and this giraffe, like in Tanzania. But then when I went back and talked to an elder from the Maasai people, he told me that the border was an egregious human rights violation, even with nothing, right? Because the Maasai people were on both sides. His mother was born in Tanzania. Like it disrupted your ability to organize, right? So even like how it was drawn, and it was very like the independence in Kenya happened in 1963. So the colonial nature of it was very present because it's drawn from the colonial process. So that whole thing, I don't know, each one is different, but there's very similar explanations, and there's similarities.
My parents are indigenous migrants from Guatemala. They came here after the Civil War in the 90s, before 1994. So I'm familiar with some of my relatives' experiences through the immigration procedure, but I'm curious, I know that you spoke about indigenous migrant issues in your book. I was wondering if you can shed light on any particular information that you found, like aside from like interpretation issues within the courts. I'm just wondering if you found anything new that you hadn't found through other articles or studies.
Yeah, I remember I was talking to a man from the East Shield Triangle, and it was the previous book on the road that came out before this Bill Bridges Not Laws book. And we were talking about Guatemala and how there's all kinds of U.S. funding going into Guatemala for border patrols. So there's one called the Chorti that was on the Honduran border, and one called the Tecunuman that was on the Mexican border. And I was interviewing him about that, and he I wish I could remember exactly, but he started talking about how the border, how he was interpreting the borders as they were blockading people from leaving the country, because when he was younger, his family had left the country during the Civil War, right? So he's like, how are we going to be able to leave? So this whole idea of U.S. border externalization, and how much Guatemala, not only Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, and it's going deeper in through South America and the Caribbean. I think that's a big, huge issue that's happening with a lot of U.S. funding. I remember I went to the military base in Zacapa in Guatemala, where the Chorti they were being trained and formed. And I went to interview the commander, and the first thing the commander said to me was like, yeah, we're funded by the U.S. Embassy. So that whole dynamic of like U.S. pushing out its borders to the, of course, Mexico and the Mexican Guatemalan border, and how Guatemala itself and Honduras as well are all like getting all this financing and building these border patrols. And, you have, and I know that doesn't speak directly to indigenous migration, but it does, of course, it was interesting, to me to hear his response, that what do these borders mean? What do they mean, for anyone's movement, and how they can just entrap people and put up tons of, the whole idea, the Chorti were putting up checkpoints all over the place throughout, the highlands and the Petén, the northern Guatemala area. And so of course, that's just gonna, when you think about checkpoints and what that means and impeding people's mobility and movement.
I think we have time for one, maybe two more questions.
Thank you. I'm curious about your method of recruiting people to interview. Do you use more organic methods, or do you have an intentional method to seek out to who you want to talk to?
Both. When so this book is different because it's more, I would say this book, Bill Bridges Not Laws, is more organic. But there's a certain methodology that I wanted to bring those questions to people, and a wide variety of people. And I knew that I just didn't want to talk to. I want to talk to a bunch of different people, including people that wouldn't normally talk about borders and just hear them talk about it. But in my other books, like Empire of Borders, for example, I went to all these different places. Each place I went to, I arranged ahead of time a number of different interviews. So I always tried to like interview somebody at the US Embassy. I tried to interview a CBP attaché. I tried to interview people on the ground. I tried to interview people in the border. But the other thing I did was always leave space open. Because every time I go and do on any of these research trips, there's always things that develop on the ground. So that's what I did. That's what I do all the time. I just leave lots of space open. I set up interviews, but I leave the space open, and then I try to go with whatever starts to. So there's that bit, there's both, like a premeditated and very organic.
So it is 1 o'clock. So I'm gonna wrap this up. Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Todd. And we have, I think the library has all of your books available to check out. So if you haven't read them or you're interested in reading them and all of your free time outside of law school.
Imagine all your free time.
But yeah, thank you everyone. And we have pizza. Yeah.